Vietnamese etymological research, modern resources, methods, and recent insights. I should first of all say, hello everyone, 大家好, 大家好, chào các bạn. I would like to share some information about Vietnamese etymological research. Oh, and I'm very pleased for this opportunity to share some information and ideas. Okay, my background. I have a PhD in linguistics at the University of Hawaii 20 years ago, and my areas were in Southeast Asian linguistics, including Vietnamese, but other Southeast Asian languages, Chinese linguistics, and that included historical linguistics and dialectology and uh, um, syntactic theory, and then second language acquisition. And my dissertation was a linguistic description of the Pakah language that was in central Vietnam. It's an Austroasiatic language, like Vietnamese, but very different in terms of how it appears. I'm currently a professor at Montgomery College in the United States, and I have researched through and taught and presented at the Institute of Linguistics in Hanoi, the Viet Ngôn ngữ học Hanoi, and also the Vietnam National University, the Đại học Quốc gia Hanoi. And I have taught in the past in Taiwan and Macau. Actually, 20 years ago, after I got my PhD, I was in Yanshui, Guangzhou, a long time ago. But I was in Taiwan recently, sort of recently, 2019, I guess it was, or 2018. And as was mentioned, I'm the editor in chief of the Journal of the Southeast Asian Linguistic Society. I've done that since 2015. And here it is. And if I don't know if anybody recognizes this picture, that is from the Museum of uh, Ethnic Minorities. That museum in Hanoi. That's that big, what you call, Raum, yeah, Raum, there in the cover. And so my prior research and presenting and publishing, I don't know exactly how many, but I guess maybe several dozen at this point, or at least 40 or 40 to 50 perhaps dozen. 40 to 50 publications centered on Vietnamese language history. And that includes phonology and the lexicon and syntax and dialects, and of course the linguistic influence of Chinese on it. That's always a very important part. Austroasiatic language history and morphological typology, and Austroasiatic, I will introduce that. I will talk about that more later, but with a current focus on what is called Vietic. And Vietic is a branch of the Austroasiatic language family, and I will talk about that, various aspects of Vietic. And on Chinese linguistic influence in greater Southeast Asia, so not just Vietnamese, but also other language families, Austroasiatic and Dai, and others too. Etymology, as I will be talking about in Vietnamese and Austroasiatic in a Southeast Asian context. As you know, Southeast Asia has a very complex ethnographic mixture, and the history makes the language history there very complicated, and oops, and and I take interdisciplinary approaches to historical linguistics. So things that we would call sometimes human history, which is different from textual history. But I've looked at things such as the words for domesticated birds in China and Southeast Asia, or terms for metals and metal implements. Those are things I've researched and published about, and others. And my materials can be found at academia.edu, and there. And so you can see my collection of publications here, and oops, and so various materials, and most of it is available for download PDFs. Some of them are presentations, but many of them are publications and other, published, unpublished notes, including unpublished notes. So that's where you can find some of my materials. And I also have some recent now online video talks which deal with Vietnamese etymological issues. And as you can see here, three of them are recent. It is, of course, because of the pandemic that now we are comfortable with doing things on the internet, right? And so all of these were presented, online only. So this one here, that one was I gave that presentation. Oops, I closed that. Mm, Yeah, there we go. This one here was from a conference in Hanoi, but I wasn't in Hanoi. So just some things if you are interested. Um, but again, I've been focusing a lot on this issue of the origins of various words. No, it's not just about words. Things such as grammatical vocabulary reveal things about Vietnamese grammar, of course. And this one here about the Vietic household before and after language contact with Sinitic. Sinitic meaning, the languages that today we consider Chinese, but in the past, a long time ago, they were not, Chinese as such, but whatever, the ancestor of modern varieties of Chinese. So these things are online as well. Uh, And so let's go ahead and I would like to give you an overview of today's talk. Huh, it's funny to say today because it's tonight here and it's this morning there. But anyways, that's true. Where you are, it's tomorrow. So I guess I should call it the overview of tomorrow's talk. For me, it's today. For you, it's tomorrow. Or no, it doesn't work that way. So in the first hour, some issues and challenges in Vietnamese etymological research. And um, it is challenging. As I mentioned before, Southeast Asia is a complex area with various language groups that have been living together for centuries and even thousands of years, and have migrated around, and it's complicated and not always clear. And I will give examples of this today. I will be talking about Vietnamese, but to talk about Vietnamese, you must talk about other languages, not only Vietnamese. That's not enough. And not just Vietnamese and Chinese. That's not enough. And we need an overview of the Vietnamese language history to give some context um, for the etymological research in the first hour. I will be giving some examples, but I will increase the number of examples in this each hour. So in the first hour, there'll be some examples, plenty. More, a little bit, maybe in the second hour, the most in the third hour. In the second hour, key questions in etymology plus ethnohistorical factors and implications. And so when I say ethnohistory, um, I mean information about the sociocultural situation in the past. This is different from talking about history based on textual documents. We consider textual documents, but ethnohistory involves aspects that we think of as being, ethnography, anthropology, even. Um, uh, okay, an overview of modern data sources for etymological research. This is very important and essential, as you will see, in and around Vietnam. Okay, again, it is not enough to focus only on Vietnamese and Vietnam to understand the Vietnamese history of the Vietnamese language. And then something about the methods of data analysis. I will not be talking about technical linguistic information. I will be keeping it simple. I will not be talking to you like you are a historical linguist, okay? But I have to tell you a little bit about the methods of data analysis. And then in the third hour, an overview of etymological categories of the Vietnamese lexicon. So that means Austroasiatic and Vietic lexical retentions. That means the words that have been retained, have been kept from Austroasiatic and Vietic. And I will give you more information about the history there so that you understand what that means when I say it is retained from Austroasiatic. What does that mean in history? And I can give you some information that is um, generally agreed upon in by historical linguists and archaeologists. So I can give you some reasonably precise dates of what that means. Old and Middle Chinese loan words. And again, I'll have to cover that and see, to explain what that means. And words shared with Dai. Now, notice it's TAI, not THAI. THAI is the national language of Thailand, but this is Dai, meaning the language group. Uh, Thai is one of them, Lao is another one, Zhuang is another one. These are Dai languages. Okay. And aerial words. And when I say aerial, I mean the area of both southern China and mainland Southeast Asia, and sometimes insular Southeast Asia, even in Taiwan. Sometimes Southeast Asia is it's not just the mainland. I will save some time for discussion questions towards the end of each hour, in addition to brief breaks before hours 2 and 3. I think that's what you do for your class, right? You need some breaks, and I think I should have a break too, talking so long. Um, um, it's okay, I think, to ask some small specific questions when I'm presenting if something is unclear. I don't think I want discussion questions in the middle. I don't exactly know how much time I need. I have my list and I think I know how much time I need, but if they're discussion questions, I would like them to, I would prefer that they be towards the end of the time so that I can control the amount of time I have. I don't want to go too far over time, um, or maybe I'll have lots of time. I don't know. But anyways, I do want to hear if you have ideas or questions and such. Um, okay, so who am I? Who is the target audience here, and what are the goals of my talk? My target audience, I think of historical linguists. Well, maybe not so much, because as I said, it should be for general purposes. But historians, I think some of you are in history. I don't know. I don't know everyone's background, so I don't know what your research focus is. But for me, these are the types of people: historical linguists, historians, archaeologists, and researchers interested in ethnohistory or maybe just history in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but also a general academic audience. So that's what I'm that's who I'm talking to. I think that it's very broad, but I think that's what I'm doing approximately. What are my goals? I would like to share some modern sources of lexical data and analytical methodology for Vietnamese etymological queries in the southern China and Southeast Asian region. So this is both data and methods, right? I think that's important for people to know, even if you are not in historical linguistics. I think this is information that you should know. And I think you will understand why I say that as I give you more information, because this is not just a linguistics question. This is a bigger question of human history in Vietnam and the region. And you will see it as I present it, I hope. Another goal is noting ways that see the word effective, etymological research can bring insights into ethnohistorical queries in Vietnam. So this is where it becomes more um, interdisciplinary. So etymology plus ethnohistorical, and ethnohistorical is already kind of interdisciplinary. And I will be warning of the consequences of limited lexical data and poor methods of analysis. That's in contrast with effective research. I do want to warn about the uh, problems when people do not apply good methods of analysis. And I will give examples. Okay, some thoughts. I would like to give some thoughts about bringing Vietnamese etymology up to date, as well as Southeast Asian etymology broadly. So again, as I talk about Vietnamese, I am talking about other languages too, and that means the people in the region as well. Of course, languages exist only with people. And so we are not just talking about words, we are talking about words and languages spoken by people and people who have interacted with each other for centuries or thousands of years. So, warning, too many issues, too little time. There's a lot I have to present, and I don't know what your background is, and there's not a lot of time, so I'll do the best I can. Okay. Um, mm, all right. So, I'm sure you know the fable of the blind men and the elephant. And how do you like this picture? I found this one just on the internet and from the Edo period. I like those. I like Japanese art from this period. It's fun. It's kind of like it's kind of like 19th century manga, manhwa, right? And this elephant is extremely large. There are no elephants this large, of course, but it's fun, and you can see those two men around his leg, and we think that they think that oh, it's a tree, and the fellows on the trunk think it's a snake, and the man hanging on the spear, sorry, the tusk, thinks it's a spear, and the guys on the side think it's a wall, right? And so that's the fable. And it's useful insight because it means that humans, we are all blind a little bit, and we can't know everything, and so sometimes we misunderstand the data, the evidence that we have. And so this is what I would like to, this metaphor. I think of this metaphor for etymological research, and this, but I think it implies solutions, because as I'm going to talk today, I'm going to show you examples where people have made mistakes about assumptions because they did not have enough information. They could not see the entire uh, issue. They could not see the entire entity. And so that's this problem here, right? And so what can we do? We try to touch the trunk and the trunk and the tusks at the same time, and maybe we'll think that it's a spear trying to hit a snake. We can still misunderstand it. So how do we understand the data that we have? And so I'm going to talk about that and try to help to understand it. But I thought this was a good analogy or metaphor for etymological research of Vietnamese etymology. So struggles in Vietnamese etymology. Okay. Um, Here's some examples. There's this very interesting dictionary that probably you have not seen. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's in France, and it is by a fellow named Schneider, who apparently was very, very knowledgeable about Hannom, and very unbelievable. This dictionary is 900 something pages, and he lists in there what's called nom apparenté au chinois, nom which is related to Chinese, and I don't know the exact number. I went through the 900 pages. I looked at all of them as much as I could, and maybe there's 2,000. I think there were at least a couple per page, at least a couple per page, and that's easily 2,000 words. I think maybe I found 100, maybe 150 valid ones. Okay. There were all kinds of problems. I do not think Schneider was a linguist. He was a person involved in literature and he checked dictionaries, but he did not know linguistics. And so he made lots of, I will call them bad claims. The phonology was wrong, the semantics were wrong. Some of those words were Austroasiatic words. How can it be a Chinese word if it's an Austroasiatic? So this is, he's definitely looking at the wrong part of the elephant. And so it was very interesting. I found it very useful, but it was, very problematic. And I have published a paper recently pointing out numerous major problems with a publication that was claiming by non-linguists, they're not linguists, claiming ancient Vietnamese Malay lexical exchange. And I won't show you the article, but I can share this PDF if you would like to take a look at it. But oh, it's very problematic. And I will show a couple of samples later on in the talk. Recently, two economists contacted me, and they were interested in trying to understand doing research on loan words. And because they are economists, what they try to do is use what you can call big data, and big data meaning getting large amounts of data and running it through some kind of analytical computer program and to see what you get, because that's what economists do. They take large amounts of data, and they don't just look at money, they look at social behavior. And so that's what they were trying to do. But the data that they sent me was extremely problematic that I looked at. They wanted me to see if they were trying to see if they could get me to check it a little bit to see if their method was working. And I had to say, well, the data was extremely problematic. I think everybody here knows that in Vietnamese, words can have one syllable or two syllables. There are lots of words with two syllables. They only sent me words with one syllable, and some of these were not really words, they were half of words. So they did not know about Vietnamese. And then they had lists of Chinese characters next to them. I don't know where they got this data, but they had all of the Chinese characters, or I guess Han Nom characters, but it seemed to be all Chinese, not Nom. And then they had these Cantonese pronunciations next to them, and I asked them, I said, why did you put Cantonese there? Cantonese is not, you know. They thought perhaps that could be the source, and I will explain later. This is I think, a common misunderstanding that somehow Cantonese, which is a modern language, gave words to Vietnamese. But of course, the words that are in Vietnamese, which are Chinese words, they were a long time ago, before there was really a language called Cantonese, even before there was a language really that we could consider Vietnamese. I will explain this idea a little bit later. Fairloose, he is a top expert in Vietic, and he reconstructed the words for pineapple and papaya in Proto-Vietic. But these are colonial era transports from South and Central America. They can only be have been in Vietnamese and in Southeast Asia from perhaps, a few hundred years ago. They cannot be a proto language word, which would mean, a few thousand years ago. So this was a misunderstanding. The reason is these words, pineapple and papaya, have been spread into the region. And then because they are spread into the region, we can do what's called a reconstruction. I will show you some reconstructions. If you don't know what they are, I will explain what they are. But to reconstruct the words from some time in the past, they cannot be that way. So it's he reconstructed them, but they cannot be reconstructed to that period. It's not logical, because they did not exist in Southeast Asia 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Um, Lastly, and not leastly, myself, I have refuted my own prior claim of lexical evidence of the what's called Vieto-Katuic, and I will not explain that exactly, but I'll explain what Vietic and Katuic is a little bit later. But it's a hypothesis that has been around for a while, and I think that the evidence doesn't support it anymore. That's my opinion based on new data. So, um, um, my main concern is that a reasonable methodological approach, an approach that is reasonable and methodological, is taken when linguistic data is used to make claims about the ethnohistory of the people of Vietnam. It is very important that we try to use a very good method, because when we make these claims, if I say that there were pineapples and papayas, no, that's not right. That is incorrect historical information, incorrect ethnohistory of the people of Vietnam. And I don't want to do that. I want to show respect to the Vietnamese people. This is not just an academic exercise. So I want that to, I have to say that. Okay. All right. So let's look at some examples now. Here's some nice examples. There we are, two types of hats, right? Mu and non. And so here's what I can say first. I'm going to say with weak data, in other words, incomplete. Mu is vaguely similar to the Sino-Vietnamese Mao. And also we can consider Cantonese Mo. But there's also this Thai word muok, hat. But it has a final K sound. If you see that, there's this K sound. Well, that looks different. But can we hypothesize that Cantonese was the source? It looks a little bit like hat. Here's Vietnamese non, that conical hat. It's a very useful hat, I will say. It's good for the rain and good for the sun. Such a form, this word, when I say form, I mean a word, it's not in any variety of Chinese or Thai, not this word. It seems vaguely similar to Khmer duan, a conical straw or leaf hat. Can they be related? Could these two words be related? Okay. Now, here's what happens. The approaches above are misguided. Okay, so that means those questions are not going to be answered well. How can focusing on only a few major languages, such as Cantonese, Thai, and Duan, how can that be sufficient for etymological research? It can't. It cannot be sufficient. How can claims be valid without consideration of historical phonology? And when I say phonology, I mean, I said something about, oh, this has this final K, and this one has a D instead of an N. And I can't say anything unless I know something about historical phonology. And so this is the problem I have seen sometimes. Sometimes people want to say things about Vietnamese or other languages, but they don't know more than just, there's some Cantonese and Mandarin and Thai and Khmer, but there's many more languages, and they don't know anything about the historical phonology, so they're just guessing. That's not a good method. So let's take a look at what you can do. And so here's a foggy situation, and so here's a Vietnamese word, mu, fog. Okay, and we can compare that with the Sino-Vietnamese, which is kind of more literary, vu. Okay, because if you take the Chinese character wu, and then the Sino-Vietnamese reading is vu with the zona, but the Vietnamese word there mu has a zo huyen and an m instead of a v. Okay, so well, let's see how that compares. And here's something called Middle Chinese. Middle Chinese, I want I'm going to oversimplify, but this Middle Chinese is about 1,000 years ago. It's more than 1,000 years ago, but there's sort of like an early Chinese, Middle Chinese, and a late Middle Chinese. So we'll just sort of say I don't know, the end of the Tang Dynasty, something like that. And so something that has an M. So, oh, actually, Vietnamese has a little similarity to that. Okay. And the V seems to be a later development. Okay. So this is probably earlier. Old Chinese, oh my gosh, look at this. That is a very complex looking thing. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. This is a reconstruction because you can see this asterisk here. And so Old Chinese, it could be that this pronunciation is 3,000 years old, but it might extend to the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. And then if it did, it might not be exactly the same. So this is a little hard to work with, but you get the idea. It's more complicated than Middle Chinese. That's the bottom line. There's something else there. Now, here is something called Proto-Vietic. And here is a Proto-Vietic word for fog. And by the way, this is Ferlus, the Professor Ferlus, who I mentioned before. Okay, so something like Khmok. Now that doesn't look very much like mu, but there is this word Vietnamese du, mop, and oh, okay, well, du and fog are a little related, but is that safe? We don't know. Other Austroasiatic languages, though, here is something important. Look at this. Bahnarik is in Vietnam. Katuic, this language has Mok. And Camuic has also in Vietnam. Some of those have this. And then Mangic, which is in northern Vietnam, close to the Chinese border, or up into China, this word here. And it looks like Austroasiatic has this. So this looks to me like it's probably a kind of Austroasiatic word that's in Vietic. Now, Tibeto-Burman, which is basically not the Sinitic part of the Sino-Tibetan language family, uh, uh, hundreds of languages here, we suddenly see something that looks vaguely familiar, or mokir, and we can see that, oh, goodness gracious, they seem to be somewhat similar, but there's this R thing here. And it looks like, by the way, this is by reconstruction is by the scholars Baxter and Cigar, and it looks like, I don't know, did they get influenced by this? How did they figure this out? Well, anyways, something's going on. We can see connections here, but it's, as I said, it's a foggy situation. Proto-die hmok. Okay, well, we see there it's got something that seems to resemble it. Okay. And Proto-Mian, there's Hmong-Mian, like the Hmong language, but Mian is the other group, and it's not in Proto-Hmong-Mian, but only in Mian, and it does look like, I think, this one looks about as close to Vietnamese as it gets. So maybe they both come from some early Middle Chinese form. We don't know, but that's a reasonable hypothesis. So we have these reconstructed words of groups of languages. It's kind of geolinguistic approach. We're comparing in a historically connected region. All right, so that's what I'm doing here, trying this out. Words for natural phenomena are much less likely to be borrowed than, for example, trade items such as clothing. This is something called the World uh, Loanword database. And in it, you can find all of these meanings, and you can search, for example, for the word fog, and you can see that 0.14 for that. But we had that hat before, and it's 0.49, much higher. What that means is that natural phenomenon like fog, that's not borrowed so often. But hats, the words for hats, are much more likely to be borrowed. That's actually fairly high. That's a fairly high rate. Okay, well then how do we interpret this? Do people borrow the word for fog? It seems like an odd word to borrow. So it is possible to suggest borrowing of this mu form, like in Vietnamese and in Hmong Mien, but we must acknowledge uncertainty of the origins and path of the Khmuic form. So here's what I'm going to tell you. This is interesting data, and we don't know the answer. This is, I could arbitrarily say, well, I think it's all from Chinese. Well, why do you think that? Well, because Chinese is so big and important. Well, was it so big and important 2,500 years ago? Hmm, I don't know. It's not the same. And so we can't make any claims, and I don't have any archaeology for it. Fog is not in the archaeological record. So this is a foggy situation indeed. And so I'm just showing you what's involved. So don't just look at two languages. Okay, what time is it? I know we started a little bit late. I'll try to adjust according to the time. All right, so Vietnamese language history research. Um, Vietnamese language history research goes back 150 years, more than 100, like 170 years. And this Mon Anam language family, the Mon language, but also then Anam, this was actually noted about 100 almost 170 years ago. It's amazing that's the case. Um, but by the end 20th century, we started to see more evidence for this Austroasiatic group, and I've noted there Blagden, 1894, and I've looked at that list. It's pretty good. He had some pretty good data, even 150, 100, sorry, 125 years ago. Um, uh, Major progress in SV, that means Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary, and comparative Viet Muong, I'll mention what that is a little bit later, in Austroasiatic. Start of the Dai Vietnamese hypothesis, Maspero, 1912. Very important work. It's like it's a monograph of 120 pages. Very important early ideas. Lots of interesting data in there, even though it's over 100 years ago. Now, during the 20th century, there were various hypotheses attempting to relate Vietnamese with Austronesian and even Japanese. All of these had problematic data and methods, all of them. There is no, and I'm going to show some more samples of the ones with Austronesian. It's not there. The data does not support any deep connection between Vietnamese and Austronesian, and the Japanese is just not. No, sorry, there is no data for that. Those old ideas, the data is all bad. Sorry. From the mid 20th century onward, uh, there was this work on Chinese loanwords. Some very good progress. These names here are important scholars in the field who did important work. Developments in Proto Viet Minh in the 60s and 70s there. Okay. In the mid 20th century, this name Audricourt and hypothesis of tonogenesis. I do not have time to explain tonogenesis. I can only say it means the origins of tones. And his ideas affected both Vietnamese and Chinese and Dai and Hmong Mien. It was very valuable, his hypothesis, and it has been supported since then. Lots of data support it, and the connection of Austroasiatic to Vietnamese, right? So look at that, 100 years after Logan, and something. It takes a long time sometimes for things to develop. And a late 20th century understanding of Vietic, Ferlus, Hayes, and others, and in fact, Tezoi, who is here, and of Vietic, and instead of Viet Minh, Vietic, and I'll explain what that is in the next slide. Then the Vieto-Katuic hypothesis, I don't support that anymore, and I will not explain why. I will just say there is new data, and the data does not support it. Okay, so here is some hypothesized stages from Austroasiatic to Vietnamese. Okay, this is not too complicated, and uh, it. I think you'll understand it even if you've never studied linguistics before. Just the ideas that they're times, kind of like historical periods. That's all. And this is based on a combination of historical and comparative linguistics combined with archaeological and historical points of reference. Okay. So when I say Austroasiatic dispersal, that means when the group of people are hypothesized to have spread. There is archaeological evidence for this happening about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BCE. So when we talk about Austroasiatic words, it could be 4,000 years or somewhat earlier. For Proto-Vedic, there is no clear information that proves when Vedic becomes like a separate language group. There is no clear information. However, the beginning of the Bronze Age in mainland Southeast Asia, at least in northern Vietnam, is about 1000 BCE. That's what the archaeologists say. That's not me. Okay, these things are archaeologists' hypotheses about Neolithic expansion and the Bronze Age. But I think this is a good point of reference. It is 1,000 years after Austroasiatic. It is a time, the Bronze Age is when cultural developments happen. I think this is a reasonable point of reference. I am not saying Vedic is is 3,000 years old. I am saying that this is maybe a good time to consider that Vedic was separate from other Austroasiatic groups by that time. Um, then in the Han Dynasty, we have this heavy Sinitic Vietic contact. Notice I didn't say Sino Viet, I said Sinitic Vietic. And that's because 2,000 years ago, there was no Vietnamese. Vietnamese was a different thing. Whatever the ancestor was, it was very different. You saw that Chinese, old Chinese form. Did that look like a Chinese word? No, languages are very different. They're like separate languages 2,000 years ago, right? What was English 2,000 years ago? We would not understand it. So this is the same thing here. Later, before Vietnamese, we have this stage of what's called Viet Minh. And I'm sure you've heard of the Minh people. It's not just one group, they speak many different types, but they are similar, they are related, kind of like a bunch of dialects. Okay, so Vietnamese and Minh and Muon are these Viet Minh, about 1,000 CE. So all of these are very approximate, but that was the end of the Chinese administration. So a little bit of history, a little bit of archaeology. Okay, Austroasiatic, Vietic, Sinitic Vietic contact, Viet Minh, and then Vietnamese. And basically, whoops, I put the first, I meant the second. I meant the second millennium CE. That was a mistake. I should have put second here, not first. Okay, let's see. What time is it? Okay, I can finish pretty quickly so we can kind of catch up. All right, so this this is the context. Okay, this is important to understand approximately Austroasiatic, then the Vietic branch, Sinitic Vietic contact, Viet Minh. I will not talk about Vietnamese. I'm only going to talk about up to Viet Minh. Then I'm going to stop. I'm not going to talk about modern Vietnamese. That's not what my goal is today. And so, where was Vietnamese or where was Vietic in the past? So let's look at a map. Here's a map of the Vietic languages. And in this map here, of course, we know that Vietnamese is sort of everywhere, right? But there are approximate areas of Hmong, approximate areas of Hmong. Then we have what I will call these archaic languages down here, such as the Chut languages. Here's the Mai, Rok, Sak, Arem, and the Maliang and Tavung, and there's the Mun I mentioned before, and so we have these more. Well, Mun is related to Hmong, so, but these are very archaic, and we can we 2,000 years ago, when the Chinese first arrived in Vietnam, we can, I think, and I think there is evidence for this, I think we can assume that Vietic was in this general region. Now, was Vietnamese 2,000 years ago like Vietnamese today? No. Vietnamese 2,000 years ago would not have tones. Chinese did not have tones. That's what the current hypothesis is. That's not my hypothesis. That's what many scholars hypothesize. And tonogenesis happened, the creation of tones, and it happened in Vietnamese later as well. But we can just assume that not Vietnamese, Vietic was in this general region. Okay, there were Thai groups up here, Vietic down here. Okay, so that's our kind of historical context. All right. Okay. So Vietnamese language affiliation and language contact, and then after this we can pause. So the language affiliation, Vietic branch of the Austroasiatic language family. So I've mentioned Vietic, I've mentioned Austroasiatic. Let's take a quick look at a map. Okay, and so this here, and so we see Vietic all the way down the coast. And as you know, that Nam Tien, that southern expansion, that's only in the last 500 years, right? So really, Vietic was up here, okay, in 2,000 years ago, or even even 1,000 years ago. Okay, here's Katuic, that one I was saying, talking about Vieto-Katuic, as though Vietic and Katuic had maybe a common origin, but I don't think there is good evidence for it. Another important group, a large group in Vietnam, kind of in the south, central south, is Bahnaric, and I mentioned Khmuic. Doesn't there are not a lot of Khmuic in Vietnam. They're mostly in Laos, right? You can see there, and it says Peconic here. That was Mang. I mentioned the Mang language. There's a little bit in Vietnam actually, but as you can see, Austroasiatic is even over here in eastern India, right? And Nicobarese down here, these islands, the Aslian languages in Malaysia. Okay, this is where Austroasiatic is. That's a pretty big range, and I'll talk about Austroasiatic later on when I provide samples, but this is what we're thinking about. Okay. Contact languages in the pre-modern era. And when I say contact languages, I mean, for example, the Chinese, well, Sinitic was in contact with Vietic. Okay, Sinitic languages, Old Chinese, Middle Chinese, pre-modern ancestral languages of modern varieties of Chinese. So we are not talking about modern Mandarin. We are not talking about modern Cantonese. Okay, we're not talking about modern Taiwanese. We're talking about the ancestral languages. Dai languages, Proto-Dai, or other early Kradai, Tai Kadai groups. You may have seen the terms Kradai or Tai Kadai, and Dai is one group, and that's the closest one to Vedic. But we're not talking about modern Thai, we're not talking about modern Lao, we're not talking about modern Zhuang, okay? Dai languages in the pre-modern era, and these neighboring Austroasiatic languages, specifically Katuic and Bahnaric, but also Khmeric. The Khmer, but there's a couple of varieties of Khmer, but basically Khmer is the main one. I don't put the Cham languages, the Cham, I don't put that here. I do not think there's much evidence of much contact. There's not much lexical evidence for that. Okay, so far, general issues. We have looked at Vietnamese language history. I know it's very quick, but that sort of Austroasiatic, Vietic, Sinitic Vietic contact, Viet Minh, the language affiliation, um, and language contact. We've covered that. And I've given you some examples as well, some samples of etymologies and problems. Okay. Um,